You forgot the salt again, Mom. Honestly, you're losing it. The words hit me like a slap across my weathered cheek. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if you, for just 1 second, feel like this sounds familiar, I just ask that you leave a like and subscribe, because this story might help someone draw closer to God's love. Amen. My name is Linda Margaret Thompson, and at 73 years old, I've learned that the cruelest wounds don't come from strangers. They come from the children you raised with your own trembling hands, the ones you prayed over every single night for decades. The kitchen of my daughter's suburban Chicago home felt smaller each day, despite its granite countertops and stainless steel appliances that gleamed under harsh LED lights. I stood at the stove in my faded floral apron, the same one I'd worn while cooking Sunday dinners for 30 years, stirring a pot of green beans that would never taste quite right without that forgotten pinch of salt. My arthritis-gnarled fingers gripped the wooden spoon Ray had carved for me on our 20th wedding anniversary, back when his hands were steady and his laugh filled every corner of our little house on Maple Street. The spoon bore the smooth indentations of countless meals prepared with love, now reduced to this moment of public humiliation in a kitchen that would never truly be mine. "I'm sorry, honey," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the simmering vegetables. "I can add some now." "Don't bother," Emily snapped, her manicured fingernails clicking against her wine glass as she gestured dismissively. "Tyler and Madison won't eat them anyway. They're too sophisticated for plain vegetables." Her laugh carried no warmth, only the bitter edge I'd grown to recognize as disappointment. In me, in my cooking, in my very presence in her pristine home. Emily stood near the kitchen island wearing a charcoal business suit that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. Her blonde hair pulled back in the kind of severe style that made her look perpetually angry. At 45, she'd inherited her father's determined jaw and my green eyes, though hers had grown cold over the years, calculating in ways that reminded me of the financial spreadsheets she worked with at her downtown accounting firm. Her husband, Doug, emerged from his home office, cell phone pressed against his ear as he discussed some real estate deal that required his immediate attention. He acknowledged my presence with the briefest of nods, the same courtesy he might show a delivery person, before returning to his conversation about property values and market projections. In his navy polo shirt and khakis, he looked every inch the successful suburban businessman who'd never known a day of real struggle, never understood what it meant to stretch a dollar until it screamed. The dining room table was set for 4, as it had been every evening for the 3 years I'd lived in this house. My place was at the far end, closest to the kitchen, where I could easily retrieve forgotten items or clear dishes without disrupting the family's conversation. The good china, wedding gifts from Ray's side of the family, remained locked away in the hutch, deemed too valuable for everyday use, even though every day was all I had left. Through the picture window, I could see the perfectly manicured lawn Doug paid a service to maintain, the ornamental trees planted in precise rows, the neighbors' houses that all looked remarkably similar with their 2-car garages and circular driveways. This was the American dream Emily had worked so hard to achieve, and somehow my presence here felt like a stain on the perfection she'd spent years cultivating. My bedroom, though Emily insisted on calling it the guest room, was upstairs at the end of the hall, furnished with pieces they'd bought from a discount furniture store when I'd moved in. A narrow twin bed, a small dresser with drawers that stuck, and a window that looked out onto the neighbor's air conditioning unit. The walls were bare except for a single framed photograph of Ray and me on our wedding day, our faces young and full of hope for a future that seemed to stretch endlessly before us. In that photo, I wore my mother's pearl necklace and a dress I'd sewn myself, my dark hair styled in soft waves that took hours to achieve with hot rollers and determination. Ray stood beside me in his Navy uniform, handsome and proud, his arm around my waist with the protective gesture of a man who'd promised to love and cherish me until death do us part. We'd kept that promise for 42 years, through illness and financial struggles, through the joy of Emily's birth and the heartbreak of 3 miscarriages that followed. But death had parted us, and now I was left to navigate this strange new world where love felt conditional and my very existence seemed to burden the people I'd sacrificed everything to nurture and protect. The worst part wasn't Emily's impatience or Doug's indifference. It was the silence from my grandchildren. Tyler, now 16, had grown tall and lanky like his grandfather, but he spoke to me only when absolutely necessary, usually to ask me to move my Bible from the living room coffee table because his friends were coming over. Madison, 13 and beautiful with her father's dark hair and my old stubbornness, treated me like furniture, present but invisible, necessary but unremarkable. I remembered when they were small, how they'd run to me with scraped knees and hurt feelings, how I'd bake cookies with them on rainy afternoons and read bedtime stories until my voice grew hoarse. I'd taught Tyler to tie his shoes and helped Madison with her multiplication tables, spending hours at this same kitchen table working through homework problems with the patience that only grandmothers possess. Now they barely looked up from their phones when I entered a room, these children I'd loved so fiercely, who'd once believed I could fix anything with a kiss and a Band-Aid. That evening, as I prepared for bed in my narrow room, I opened my worn leather Bible, the same one Ray had given me for our first Christmas as husband and wife. Its pages were soft from decades of turning, marked with verses that had sustained me through every season of life. I'd underlined Psalm 27:10 in blue ink years ago. Though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me. Tonight those words felt like prophecy. I knelt beside my bed, my knees protesting against the thin carpet, and folded my hands in prayer as I'd done every night for over 60 years. "Dear Jesus," I whispered, my voice cracking with exhaustion and heartbreak, "I don't understand why you've brought me here. I don't understand why loving them feels so thankless, why trying to help feels so unwelcome. Show me what you want from me. Show me if I'm supposed to stay silent, or if it's time to remember who I used to be before I became their burden." The house settled around me with small creaks and sighs, the sounds of a structure built for family but feeling more like a prison each passing day. Somewhere down the hall, Emily and Doug discussed their weekend plans in voices that never included me, making decisions about family gatherings I'd only hear about after they'd already happened. Outside my window, the neighbor's dog barked at shadows while streetlights cast long rectangles across my ceiling. I closed my eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to matter, to be valued, to be seen as more than a problem to be managed or a mistake to be tolerated. But sleep wouldn't come, and in the darkness, I began to wonder if Emily was right. Maybe I was losing it. Maybe forgetting the salt was just the beginning of a decline I was too proud to acknowledge, too frightened to face. Maybe it was time to accept that the woman who'd raised a daughter, buried a husband, and survived 73 years of joy and sorrow was finally becoming the burden everyone seemed to think she was. The morning light filtered through my small window, casting shadows across the prayer journal I'd kept hidden beneath my mattress for the past year. 367 entries of whispered conversations with God, each one a desperate plea for understanding, for patience, for the strength to endure another day of feeling invisible in the home I'd helped purchase. I dressed carefully in my navy cardigan and sensible shoes, the same outfit I wore to church every Sunday, and to the grocery store twice a week. In the mirror, I saw my mother's face staring back, the same worried lines around eyes that had seen too much disappointment, the same way of holding her shoulders as if bracing for the next blow. Downstairs, Emily was already rushing through her morning routine, grabbing her travel mug and briefcase while barking instructions at Tyler about his soccer practice and reminding Madison to walk the dog before school. The kitchen counter was littered with half-eaten breakfast items and spilled coffee, evidence of a family too busy to pause for genuine connection. "Mom, Tyler needs $20 for the field trip today," Emily announced without looking at me, her voice carrying the expectation that had become all too familiar. And Madison's violin lessons went up again. Another 30 a week. I nodded silently, calculating how much remained in my modest checking account after last month's emergencies, Doug's car repair, Emily's dental work, the new refrigerator they'd decided was necessary for the kitchen renovation I'd never been consulted about. For 3 years, every unexpected expense had somehow become my responsibility. Every financial shortfall cushioned by what Emily called Grandma's contribution to the family. What she didn't know was that my contribution went far beyond the monthly checks I wrote. Hidden in my bedroom closet was a shoebox containing receipts that told the true story of my generosity. Christmas gifts for the children that Emily took credit for purchasing, utility bills I'd quietly paid when Doug's commission checks ran low, groceries I'd bought with my Social Security money while they complained about my simple tastes and dietary restrictions. After they left for work and school, I sat at the kitchen table with my morning tea, remembering the day Ray and I had first visited this house when Emily was considering buying it. "It's too much house for us," she'd confided then, her voice soft with uncertainty. "But Doug thinks it's an investment." Ray had walked through every room with his contractor's eye, pointing out the solid bones beneath the cosmetic flaws. "Good foundation," he'd said, running his weathered hands along the crown molding. "Built to last." When Emily couldn't qualify for the mortgage alone, I'd offered our life savings as a gift for the down payment. $50,000 we'd accumulated through decades of careful budgeting and sacrifice. Ray had already been diagnosed with cancer, and we both knew I'd need a place to go when he was gone. "Consider it an investment in our future together," I'd told Emily that day, signing the bank documents with a steady hand and a full heart. Now, sitting in the kitchen I'd helped buy, I wondered if Ray would recognize the daughter we'd raised, the little girl who used to climb into our bed during thunderstorms, who'd cried when her goldfish died, and insisted we hold a proper funeral in the backyard. The teenager who'd brought me dandelions and called them sunshine flowers, who'd practiced her piano recitals for me every afternoon after school. That Emily had grown into a woman who scheduled our conversations like business meetings, who spoke to me with the patient tone reserved for difficult clients. When I'd had pneumonia last winter, she'd arranged for a home health aide rather than staying home from work herself. When I'd suggested we plant a small garden together in the spring, she'd hired a landscaping service instead, explaining that my methods were too old-fashioned for their aesthetic goals. The phone rang, interrupting my melancholy reflection. Emily's voice was tight with stress when I answered. "Mom, I forgot about Madison's orthodontist appointment this afternoon. Can you take her? It's at 3:30 on Elm Street." I glanced at the clock. "Of course, honey. But I don't drive anymore, remember? My license expired last year." The silence stretched between us, filled with her unspoken frustration. "Right. Well, call an Uber then. I'll reimburse you." She wouldn't, of course, just like she hadn't reimbursed me for the taxi to my own doctor's appointment last month, or the delivery fees for the prescription medications I needed when Doug was too busy to pick them up from the pharmacy. That afternoon, as Madison and I sat in the orthodontist's waiting room, I tried to engage my granddaughter in conversation. She wore earbuds and stared at her phone screen, occasionally typing responses to messages from friends who seemed infinitely more interesting than her grandmother. "How's school going, sweetheart?" I asked, gently touching her arm. She looked up with the exaggerated patience teenagers reserve for adults who don't understand their busy lives. "Fine, Grandma. Just fine. Are you still playing violin? You used to love—" "That was forever ago," Madison interrupted, her attention already returning to her phone. "I'm into different things now." I remembered the little girl who used to beg me to listen to her practice, who'd perform impromptu concerts in our living room with a cardboard violin when she was too small for a real one. I'd applauded every screechy note, praised every halting melody, convinced that I was witnessing the birth of a musical prodigy. Now she couldn't spare 2 minutes for conversation with the woman who'd driven 4 hours to attend every single recital, who'd cheered louder than anyone when she'd won the middle school talent show. That evening, I retreated to my room early, claiming fatigue when Emily asked if I wanted to watch television with them. Instead, I opened my Bible to Psalm 102, reading aloud in a whisper, "Hear my prayer, Lord. Let my cry for help come to you. Do not hide your face from me when I am in distress." I thought about the prayer meeting I used to attend at my old church, before I'd moved here and lost touch with the women who'd been my spiritual sisters for 40 years. We'd gathered every Wednesday evening in the church basement, sharing our burdens and lifting each other up with genuine faith and fellowship. Here, Emily attended a modern church with contemporary music and coffee in the lobby, a place where relationships seemed as polished and surface level as everything else in her life. I'd tried to join a women's Bible study there, but the conversations rarely moved beyond discussions of home decorating and vacation plans. "Am I being tested, Lord?" I whispered into the darkness. "Or just forgotten?" The house was quiet around me, but through the thin walls, I could hear Doug talking on the phone in his office, his voice animated as he discussed some business opportunity that required immediate action. These conversations happened nightly, always behind closed doors, always involving sums of money that made my modest pension seem insignificant. Sometimes I wondered if they'd forgotten I could hear their arguments about finances, their discussions about my situation, as if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. Emily's voice would rise when she thought I was asleep, complaining about the cost of my prescription medications, questioning why I needed so many doctor's appointments for conditions that seemed manageable to her untrained eye. "She's becoming a burden," I'd heard Doug say last month, his words drifting up through the heating vents. "Maybe it's time to start looking at assisted living facilities." Emily's response had been too quiet to hear, but the suggestion hung in the air like a threat, a reminder that my place in this house was temporary, conditional on my usefulness and their patience. I pulled my mother's quilt closer around my shoulders, the one she'd sewn during the Depression, when fabric was precious, and every stitch carried hope for better days. The quilt had covered me through childhood illnesses and adult sorrows, through the long nights of Ray's final months when sleep seemed impossible, and prayer was my only comfort. In those days, I'd known my purpose. I'd been Ray's wife, Emily's mother, Tyler and Madison's grandmother. I'd had roles that defined me, relationships that gave meaning to my daily existence. Now I felt like a ghost haunting someone else's life, welcome nowhere and needed by no one. My 74th birthday arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, marked only by the absence of acknowledgement. I woke before dawn, as I had for decades, and lay in the narrow bed listening to the house breathe around me, the familiar creaks and sighs of a structure that had never quite accepted my presence. I dressed slowly, my arthritic fingers struggling with the small buttons on my best blouse. The pale blue one Ray had always said brought out my eyes. In the bathroom mirror, I whispered, "Happy birthday, Linda," to my reflection, the words echoing off tile walls that had never heard such sentiment spoken aloud within these walls. Downstairs, the kitchen was already a battlefield of morning chaos. Emily stood at the counter, aggressively spreading peanut butter on sandwich bread while simultaneously checking her phone for messages that couldn't wait until she reached her office. Doug sat at the breakfast bar, scrolling through financial news on his tablet, occasionally muttering about market fluctuations and investment opportunities. Tyler grabbed an energy bar from the pantry, his 6-foot frame moving with the restless energy of a teenager perpetually late for something important. Madison emerged from upstairs looking perfectly assembled despite claiming she'd overslept, her backpack slung over one shoulder with practiced indifference. I stood by the coffee maker, waiting for someone to notice the date, to remember that 74 years ago, I'd entered this world as someone's precious daughter, someone's answered prayer. Instead, Emily glanced at her watch and announced, "I'll be late tonight. Client dinner downtown." "Mom, can you handle pickup from soccer practice?" "Of course," I replied, though I wondered how I was supposed to transport Tyler without a car or driver's license. These details never seemed to occur to them until the last moment, when their oversight became my emergency to solve. "And the grocery list is on the counter," Emily continued, already reaching for her briefcase. "Doug needs those special protein bars for his workout routine. They're expensive, but his trainer says they're essential." I nodded, calculating the cost against my Social Security check, while Emily listed items that would consume most of my monthly budget. Organic vegetables for Doug's cleanse diet, imported cheese for the wine and book club she hosted every month but never invited me to join, premium coffee beans for the espresso machine they'd installed, but I wasn't allowed to use because it was too complicated for someone my age. After they left, I sat at the kitchen table with my morning tea, staring at the calendar where every square was filled with their activities: Emily's work commitments, Doug's golf tournaments, Tyler's games, Madison's lessons. My doctor's appointments were noted in small print at the bottom of squares, afterthoughts squeezed between more important obligations. The silence felt heavier today, weighted with the knowledge that I'd lived 3/4 of a century and somehow become invisible to the people I loved most. I opened my prayer journal and wrote, "Dear Jesus, Is this what you had in mind when you blessed me with long life? To become a burden so gradually that I didn't notice until it was too late to stop. The day passed in familiar rhythms of solitude. I cleaned house with the meticulous care of someone who had nothing else to occupy her time, scrubbing surfaces that were already spotless, organizing cabinets that remained perfectly arranged from yesterday's efforts. Every task was performed quietly, efficiently, leaving no evidence of my presence for Emily to criticize when she returned home. At noon, I walked to the mailbox, hoping perhaps for a birthday card from a distant relative or an old friend who'd remembered. Instead, I found bills addressed to Emily and Doug, advertisements for home improvement services they couldn't afford, and a single envelope for me, a statement from the bank showing my dwindling account balance. The afternoon stretched endlessly before me. I tried calling my old friend Margaret from my previous church, but her daughter informed me that Margaret was napping and couldn't be disturbed. She gets confused when people call, the daughter explained with the patronizing patience reserved for elderly women who didn't understand modern boundaries. I'd lost touch with most of my friends after moving here. 3 years of missing Wednesday prayer meetings, Sunday dinners, and Friday afternoon coffee dates had gradually eroded relationships that had sustained me for decades. Emily had assured me I'd make new friends in her neighborhood, but the women here were younger, busier, focused on careers and children who still needed them. As evening approached, I began preparing dinner, choosing recipes I knew the family would enjoy even though my own appetite had diminished to almost nothing. The kitchen filled with the aroma of roast chicken and homemade rolls, comfort foods that had once brought my family together around tables that seemed warmer than this sterile granite surface. Tyler arrived home first, dropping his soccer gear in the mudroom without acknowledging my greeting. He grabbed a sports drink from the refrigerator and headed upstairs, earbuds already in place to block out any attempt at conversation. Madison followed 30 minutes later, her expression stormy from whatever teenage drama had dominated her day. She glanced at the dinner preparations with the critical eye she'd inherited from her mother, then announced she wasn't hungry and would eat later. When Emily and Doug finally returned, they were deep in conversation about a potential promotion that would require longer hours but significantly more money. They discussed vacation plans and home improvements with the animated enthusiasm of people whose dreams remained within reach. I served dinner on the good plates I'd inherited from my mother, hoping somehow the occasion would feel special even without acknowledgement. The meal passed in relative silence, punctuated only by requests to pass condiments and complaints about work stress that apparently required immediate solutions. As I cleared the dishes, Emily finally looked at me directly. "Mom, you seem tired lately. Maybe you should see the doctor again. Make sure everything's okay." Her concern felt hollow, delivered with the tone of someone checking an item off a mental list rather than expressing genuine worry about my well-being. I wanted to tell her that my fatigue wasn't medical. It was emotional exhaustion from living on the periphery of a family that had once been my entire world. Instead, I smiled and assured her I was fine, just adjusting to the changing weather. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed holding the framed photograph of Ray and me at Emily's high school graduation. We'd been so proud that day, standing between Emily and her diploma, certain we'd raised a daughter who would carry our values into her own family. Ray's arm was wrapped around my waist in the photo, his smile broad with the satisfaction of a man who'd provided well for his family. I was wearing the navy dress I'd sewn for the occasion, my hair carefully styled for one of the most important days of our lives. Looking at that photo now, I could barely remember feeling that important, that valued, that essential to someone else's happiness. I opened my Bible to Isaiah 49:15-16, reading aloud through tears. "Can a mother forget the baby at her breast and have no compassion on the child she has borne? Though she may forget, I will not forget you. See, I have engraved you on the palms of my hands." The words offered comfort, but tonight they also highlighted the bitter irony of my situation. I had not forgotten my child, but she seemed to have forgotten me. Outside my window, the neighborhood was settling into evening routines. I could see into the houses across the street, where families gathered around television screens and kitchen tables, sharing the easy intimacy of people who belong together. In one window, A grandmother was reading to a small child, both of them smiling at whatever adventure was unfolding on the page. In another, 3 generations sat around a dining table, their animated conversation visible even through the glass that separated us. I pulled my mother's quilt closer and whispered into the darkness, "Lord, I feel like I'm disappearing, not dying, just fading away until nobody notices I was ever here. Please show me if this is my cross to bear, or if you have something else in mind for these final years you've given me." The house grew quiet around me, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, I lay awake counting the ways I'd become invisible, the conversations that stopped when I entered a room, the family photos displayed throughout the house that somehow never included me, the holiday traditions that had been updated to exclude customs I'd maintained for 50 years. Tomorrow would be another day of silent service, another 24 hours of loving people who seemed to view my presence as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a gift to be treasured. But tonight, on my 74th birthday, I allowed myself to grieve for the woman I used to be, the one who mattered, who was needed, who was seen. The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning, crisp white paper that felt heavier than it should have. My name was typed across the front in official black letters, Linda Margaret Thompson. Not Mom or Grandma, my full legal name, formal and distant. Inside, I found documents from Sunset Manor Assisted Living, complete with glossy brochures showcasing smiling elderly residents engaged in crafts and bingo games. A yellow sticky note in Emily's handwriting was attached to the front page. "Just exploring options. We think you'd be happier with people your own age." My hands trembled as I read the amenities list. Shared dining room, scheduled activities, 24-hour medical supervision. The marketing language painted a picture of golden years filled with purpose and community. But I'd visited enough of these places with church friends to know the reality behind the cheerful photographs. I was still holding the brochures when Emily came downstairs, already dressed for work in her power suit and determined expression. She paused when she saw me at the kitchen table, surrounded by the evidence of their secret planning. "Oh, you found those," she said, her voice carrying the forced brightness of someone delivering news they'd rehearsed. "Doug and I thought it might be good to start looking at options. You know, for when you need more care." "I don't need more care," I replied quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. "I need to feel like I belong somewhere." Emily's laugh was sharp, edged with the impatience that had become her default response to anything I said. "Mom, you're 74 years old. You forget things. You can't drive. You have health issues that require constant monitoring. This isn't about belonging. It's about being realistic." She poured coffee into her travel mug with aggressive efficiency, the sound of liquid hitting metal punctuating her words like exclamation marks. "Besides, you'd have friends there, people who understand what you're going through." "What I'm going through," I repeated, something unfamiliar rising in my chest. A warmth that felt like anger but burned cleaner. "And what exactly am I going through, Emily?" She stopped moving, coffee mug suspended halfway to her lips. In the sudden silence, I could hear the kitchen clock ticking, the refrigerator humming, the sound of my own heartbeat growing louder. "You're getting older, Mom. That's not anyone's fault. It's just reality." "No," I said, standing up with more force than I'd used in months. "What I'm going through is being treated like a burden in a house I helped buy. What I'm going through is being ignored, dismissed, and planned around instead of planned with." Emily's expression shifted from surprise to something I recognized as the look she gave difficult clients at work. Patient but firm, designed to manage rather than engage. "Mom, that's not fair. We've given you a home. We take care of your expenses. I take care of my own expenses," I interrupted, my voice growing stronger with each word. "And most of yours too, apparently. The down payment on this house, Tyler's field trips, Madison's lessons, your emergency dental work, Doug's car repairs. Should I keep going?" The color drained from Emily's face. She set down her coffee mug with careful precision, as if sudden movements might shatter the moment into something uncontrollable. "That money was given freely," she said slowly. "You offered to help the family." "I offered to help my family," I corrected. "But families don't treat each other like inconvenient house guests." Families don't forget birthdays. Families don't discuss putting their mothers away like worn-out furniture. Doug appeared in the doorway, attracted by voices raised above their usual whispered courtesy. He was already dressed for his morning golf game, his polo shirt pristine, and his expression annoyed at having his routine disrupted. "What's all the shouting about?" he asked, though neither of us had been shouting. His definition of appropriate volume for women apparently didn't include passionate speech. "Your mother-in-law is upset about the assisted living information," Emily explained, her tone shifting to include him in a united front against my unreasonable expectations. Doug glanced at the brochures scattered across the table, then at me with the calculating look I'd seen him use when evaluating property investments. "Linda, these places are really nice now. Not like the old nursing homes. You'd have your own apartment, meals prepared, activities planned. No responsibilities, no worries. No family," I added quietly. He shrugged with the casual indifference of a man who'd never felt truly connected to anyone he couldn't use. We'd visit. Holidays, birthdays. Quality time instead of this daily stress. Daily stress. That's what my presence had become to them, a source of tension that interfered with their pursuit of happiness. I looked at these two people I'd loved and supported and sacrificed for, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in years. "Would Jesus forgive this too?" I whispered, more to myself than to them. "Should I forgive again?" Emily's face softened slightly at the mention of faith, the one area where she still occasionally acknowledged my authority. "Mom, this isn't about forgiveness. It's about what's best for everyone, including you." "Including me?" I asked. "When did you last ask me what I thought was best for me? When did you last ask me anything except whether I could solve your immediate problems?" Tyler chose that moment to bound downstairs, his teenage obliviousness providing a brief respite from the tension. He grabbed a protein bar from the pantry and was heading for the door when Emily called out to him, "Tyler, tell Grandma you think Sunset Manor sounds nice." He stopped, looking confused and uncomfortable at being pulled into adult conflict. His eyes darted between his parents and me, recognizing the minefield he'd stumbled into. I guess? I mean, if Grandma wants to move." "I don't want to move," I said clearly, looking directly at my grandson. "I want to be part of this family instead of being managed by it." Tyler's discomfort was palpable. At 16, he was old enough to understand the emotional undercurrents, but young enough to want to escape them. "I'm gonna be late for school," he mumbled, and fled through the garage door. Madison appeared a few minutes later, her timing impeccable for maximum dramatic effect. She surveyed the scene with the sharp intelligence she'd inherited from both sides of the family, immediately grasping that battle lines had been drawn. "Are you really sending Grandma away?" she asked, her voice smaller than usual. "We're not sending anyone away," Doug said with forced patience. "We're exploring options that might make everyone happier." Madison looked at me directly for the first time in months. "Do you want to leave, Grandma?" The question hung in the air between us, honest and clear in the way only children can be. Emily and Doug waited for my answer, perhaps expecting me to gracefully accept exile for the good of family harmony. Instead, I walked over to my granddaughter and took her hands in mine. "No, sweetheart. I don't want to leave. I want to be part of a family that wants me here." Madison's eyes filled with tears she was too proud to let fall. "But Mom says you're getting too old to take care of yourself." "I'm getting older," I agreed, "but I'm not helpless. And I'm not invisible, even though sometimes it feels that way." Emily made a sound of frustration, the kind of noise people make when reasonable conversations spiral beyond their control. "This is exactly why we need to consider other arrangements. You're making this so much harder than it needs to be." "For whom am I making it harder?" I asked. "For you, who want me gone? For Doug, who sees me as a financial drain? Or for Tyler and Madison, who might actually miss having a grandmother who loves them enough to fight for her place in their lives?" The silence that followed was different from the usual quiet that surrounded me in this house. This wasn't the absence of acknowledgement. It was the presence of truth, uncomfortable and undeniable. Emily gathered her briefcase and car keys with jerky, agitated movements. "We'll discuss this tonight when everyone has had time to calm down." "I am calm," I said, surprised to realize it was true. I'm also done pretending that loving you means accepting whatever treatment you decide to give me. After they left, I sat in the sudden quiet of the house, surrounded by brochures for a future I hadn't chosen. But something had shifted in the space between my heart and my voice. Something that felt like strength returning to muscles that had been dormant too long. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in over a year. Margaret, it's Linda Thompson. I know it's been too long, but I wondered, is that Wednesday prayer group still meeting? Margaret's voice on the phone was like cool water after years in the desert. Linda? Oh, sweet Jesus, I've been praying for you to call. We all have. I sat in my small room, door closed, speaking in whispers as if the walls might betray this moment of connection to people who'd been interrogating my every conversation lately. Through the phone, I could hear the familiar sounds of Margaret's kitchen, dishes clinking, the old coffee percolator she'd refused to replace, the hymn she hummed while working. The prayer group still meets every Wednesday at 7, Margaret continued, her voice warm with the kind of joy that comes from answered prayers. Sarah's still leading it, though her arthritis has gotten worse. And Ruth passed last spring, but peacefully, surrounded by her children who flew in from 3 states. My heart ached at the news of Ruth's passing, this woman who'd prayed with me through Emily's teenage rebellions and Ray's final illness. How many important moments had I missed by allowing myself to be isolated from the community that had sustained me for decades? I'd like to come tomorrow, I said, the words feeling bold and necessary, if it's not too late to rejoin. Margaret's laugh was rich with disbelief and delight. Too late? Honey, you're talking to a group of women who believe it's never too late for anything as long as there's breath in your body. Can you get transportation? The question hit me like cold reality. I had no car, no license, and requesting help from Emily or Doug felt like asking permission to exist. I'll figure something out, I said, though I had no idea how. Nonsense, Margaret replied with the practical authority of a woman who'd been solving problems for 8 decades. My grandson Tommy drives for that ride service now. Makes good money doing it too. I'll have him pick you up at 6:30. After hanging up, I sat holding the phone like a lifeline, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years, anticipation for something that belonged entirely to me. No one in this house needed to approve my participation in a prayer group. No one required my attendance at family obligations in exchange for this small freedom. The next morning, I informed Emily of my plans during breakfast, speaking with the casual confidence of someone who'd never doubted her right to make independent decisions. "You're going where?" Emily asked, her coffee mug frozen halfway to her lips. "Prayer group at my old church. I used to attend every week before I moved here." Doug looked up from his financial newspaper with the expression of someone who'd just heard an unexpected expense being announced. "How are you getting there?" "We can't drive you tonight. I've arranged my own transportation," I replied, surprised by how natural it felt to say those words. Emily and Doug exchanged the kind of look married couples use to communicate entire conversations without words. I could almost hear their silent debate. Should they forbid this? How much supervision did I require? What if I said something inappropriate about our family dynamics to these church women? "Mom," Emily said carefully, "you haven't seen these people in years. Maybe it would be better to start with something closer, more convenient." "More supervised?" I asked, though my tone remained pleasant. "I didn't say that. You didn't need to." That evening, I dressed with the care I'd once reserved for special occasions. My navy dress with the small pearl buttons, the one Ray had always said made me look elegant. My mother's cameo brooch pinned at the collar, the sensible black shoes I'd polished until they gleamed. Standing before my bedroom mirror, I saw someone I'd almost forgotten, a woman with dignity, with purpose, with places to go that mattered to her soul rather than someone else's convenience. Tommy arrived precisely at 6:30, a young man in his 20s with Margaret's kind eyes and an easy smile that suggested he'd grown up surrounded by elderly women who'd taught him proper manners. He helped me into his car with the respectful courtesy Emily's children had never learned to show me. "Grandma Maggie talks about you all the time," he said as we drove through neighborhoods I'd almost forgotten existed. "Says you used to make the best coffee cake for church potlucks." "I still remember the recipe," I replied, watching familiar landmarks pass by the window. Your grandmother's not much of a baker, but she makes up for it with her prayers. The church looked exactly as I'd left it 3 years ago. Red brick facade, white wooden doors, the simple cross that had presided over my spiritual life for 4 decades. But walking up those front steps felt like returning to myself after a long absence, like breathing air that had been specifically created for my lungs. The women were gathered in the basement fellowship hall, sitting in the same circle of folding chairs we'd used since the Carter administration. Sarah Johnson presided with gentle authority, her silver hair still pinned in the same elegant style she'd worn as a young minister's wife. The faces around the circle showed the passage of time. More wrinkles, grayer hair, a few walking aids, but the warmth remained unchanged. "Linda Thompson," Sarah announced as I appeared in the doorway, her voice ringing with genuine delight. "Look what the Lord has brought back to us." The greetings that followed were like spiritual medicine, hugs that lingered, questions about my well-being that came from genuine concern rather than obligation, expressions of joy at my return that no one had to fake for the sake of politeness. We opened with prayer, our voices joining in the familiar rhythm of women who'd been talking to God together for longer than some of their grandchildren had been alive. The words flowed around me like a river I'd been thirsty for without realizing it. "Lord, we thank you for bringing our sister Linda back to us tonight," Sarah prayed aloud. "We ask your blessing on whatever journey has led her here, and your guidance for whatever path lies ahead." During sharing time, I found myself speaking honestly for the first time in months, not about the specific details of my family situation, but about the spiritual loneliness I'd been carrying, the sense of being disconnected from purpose and community. "I've been feeling invisible," I admitted to these women who'd known me through every season of adult life. "Like I'm taking up space without contributing anything meaningful." Margaret reached over and squeezed my hand. "Honey, you're never invisible to us. And more importantly, you're never invisible to him." Ruth's replacement in the circle was a woman named Dorothy, probably 70 herself, who'd recently lost her husband of 53 years. "I know that feeling," she said quietly. "After Harold passed, my children decided I needed constant watching. Like grief had made me incompetent rather than just sad." The murmurs of understanding around the circle told me I wasn't alone in experiencing family members who confused love with control, who mistook independence for stubbornness. "Sometimes," Sarah said with the wisdom of someone who'd counseled troubled souls for 6 decades, "the people closest to us forget that we're still complete human beings with our own relationship with God. They see our limitations but not our continued capacity for growth and service." After the formal prayer time ended, we lingered over coffee and the kind of conversation that only happens between women who've earned each other's trust through years of shared confidences. I told them about the assisted living brochures, the forgotten birthday, the gradual erosion of my voice in decisions that affected my daily life. "You know what you need to do," Margaret said with characteristic directness. "You need to remember who you were before you became their project to manage." Dorothy nodded emphatically. My daughter kept saying I needed to adjust my expectations about my independence. Finally, I asked her, "When did caring for me become more important than respecting me?" The drive home with Tommy was quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts. As we pulled into Emily's driveway, he turned to me with a serious expression. "Mrs. Thompson, can I tell you something? My grandmother says you're one of the strongest women she's ever known. She says you raised your daughter mostly alone while your husband was deployed, worked 2 jobs to pay for her college, and never complained about anything." I felt tears threatening at this reminder of who I used to be. Capable, resilient, valued for my contributions rather than tolerated despite my limitations. "She also says," Tommy continued, "that sometimes the people we love most need to be reminded that love doesn't give them ownership of our dignity." Inside the house, Emily was waiting in the living room with the expression of a parent whose teenager had missed curfew. "How did it go?" she asked, though her tone suggested she was really asking whether I'd embarrassed the family by discussing our private business with outsiders. "It went beautifully," I replied, settling into my favorite chair without offering the detailed explanation she was clearly expecting. "That's good," Emily said. uncertain how to proceed when I didn't automatically provide the information she felt entitled to receive. For the first time in months, I slept deeply that night, my dreams filled with familiar voices and the sound of prayers being lifted by women who'd known me when I still knew myself. The next morning, I woke with clarity that felt like a gift from God. I picked up my phone and called the bank. "I'd like to make some changes to my account," I told the customer service representative, starting with removing all previously authorized users except myself. It was time to remember that I was Linda Margaret Thompson, not just Emily's mother, or Tyler and Madison's grandmother, or Doug's inconvenient house guest. I was a child of God with my own relationship with Him, my own value in His eyes, my own purpose in His plan, and that was going to have to be enough for everyone else, too. The explosion came 3 days later, on a Saturday morning when the entire family was home to witness what Emily would later call my complete breakdown of reason. I was in the kitchen preparing my simple breakfast when Emily stormed in, her laptop clutched against her chest like armor, her face flushed with the particular shade of red that signaled volcanic emotions barely contained. "Mom, what did you do to the bank account?" Her voice carried the sharp edge of someone who'd just discovered that their carefully constructed world had shifted without their permission. I continued buttering my toast with steady hands, though my heart was racing. "I made some changes to my personal account. Is there a problem?" "Is there a problem?" Emily's laugh was brittle, dangerous. "I've been trying to pay the contractor for the kitchen backsplash, and the bank says I don't have authorization to access the funds anymore." Doug appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of his wife's distress. He was still in his weekend casual clothes, polo shirt and khakis that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget, but his expression was all business. "Linda, what's this about removing our access to your account?" he asked, his tone carrying the patronizing patience of someone addressing a confused child. "We need to be able to help you manage your finances. That's what families do." I set down my butter knife and turned to face them both. The morning light streaming through the kitchen window seemed brighter somehow, as if God was illuminating this moment for what it truly was. A reckoning. "When did I ask you to manage my finances?" I asked quietly. Emily's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. You don't understand how complicated modern banking is. Online transfers, automatic payments, investment opportunities. You need help with these things. I managed my finances successfully for 70 years before I moved into this house," I replied. "Ray and I bought a home, raised a daughter, saved for retirement, and even helped with your college tuition. When exactly did I become incompetent?" Doug stepped forward, his face wearing the expression he probably used when explaining complex real estate contracts to clients he considered simple-minded. "It's not about competence, Linda. It's about convenience, efficiency. When we can access your account, we can take care of your bills, handle your expenses, make sure everything gets paid on time." "Which of my bills have you been paying?" I asked. The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and revealing. Emily and Doug exchanged one of their wordless married conversations, the kind that happens in micro-expressions and barely perceptible gestures. "Well," Emily began slowly, "we've been covering household expenses that benefit everyone. Groceries, utilities, maintenance. With my money?" I clarified. "With family money," Doug corrected, his voice taking on the edge of someone whose patience was wearing thin. "We're all contributing to this household." I walked to the kitchen drawer where I'd been keeping records for the past 3 years, a habit Ray had taught me decades ago when he'd said a woman should always know exactly where every dollar went. I pulled out a manila folder and set it on the counter. "These are copies of every withdrawal from my account since I moved here," I said, opening the folder to reveal neat columns of numbers in my careful handwriting. Tyler's soccer camp, $800. Madison's violin, $1,200. Emily's dental work, $2,300. Doug's car repair, $1,500. The down payment on this house, $50,000. Should I continue? Tyler had wandered into the kitchen during this recitation, probably hoping for breakfast, but instead witnessing what would become family legend. His 16-year-old face showed the uncomfortable awareness of someone old enough to understand financial discussions, but young enough to wish he could escape them. Madison followed a few minutes later, her 13-year-old intuition picking up on the tension that seemed to vibrate through the air like electricity before a storm. "What's everyone fighting about?" she asked, though the word fighting felt inadequate for what was actually happening. The careful demolition of 3 years of financial manipulation. "We're not fighting," Emily said quickly, her voice artificially bright in the way adults use when trying to protect children from adult complexities. "We're just discussing Grandma's confusion about how family finances work." "I'm not confused," I said, looking directly at my granddaughter. "I'm finally seeing clearly." Madison's eyes moved between her parents and me, her young face serious in a way that reminded me of Emily at that age, before life had taught her that love could be weaponized and family could be a business transaction. "Are you really confused, Grandma?" Madison asked with the directness that only children possess. Before I could answer, Doug interjected with the kind of authority figures use when they need to control the narrative. "Madison, your grandmother is having some difficulty understanding financial responsibilities. It's normal for people her age." "People my age," I repeated slowly, tasting the words like something bitter. "You mean people who've lived long enough to recognize manipulation when they see it?" The silence that followed was different from any quiet that had ever existed in this house. This wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of truth, uncomfortable and undeniable, settling over us like dust after an explosion. Tyler shifted uncomfortably by the refrigerator, his teenage desire to avoid family drama warring with something that looked like dawning understanding. "Wait," he said slowly. "Have you guys been using Grandma's money this whole time?" "It's not using," Emily snapped, her composure finally cracking. "It's sharing. It's being a family. It's Grandma contributing to the household that provides her with shelter and care." "Shelter and care," I repeated, the phrases feeling foreign in my mouth. "Is that what you call this? Shelter and care?" I looked around the kitchen that had never felt like mine, at the family that had never made me feel welcome, at the people I'd loved and supported, who now stood before me like strangers defending territory I hadn't realized I was invading. "Let me ask you something," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "If I'm so confused, so incompetent, so in need of management, why didn't you put me in that assisted living facility when you first started planning for it? Why keep me here if I'm such a burden?" Doug's face had gone very still, the way people look when they realize they've been caught in something they'd hoped would remain hidden. "Linda, I think you're getting upset over nothing. We can discuss this when you're feeling more rational." "I'm feeling perfectly rational," I replied. "For the first time in 3 years, I'm thinking clearly enough to ask the right questions. Like why my confused, incompetent mind was still sharp enough to be trusted with financial responsibility for your expenses." Emily's voice was rising now, taking on the shrill quality of someone whose carefully constructed justifications were collapsing. "This is exactly why we think you need more help. You're being paranoid, suspicious, turning everything into some kind of conspiracy. Or," I said quietly, "I'm finally refusing to pretend that being grateful for your tolerance is the same thing as being loved." Madison had been listening to this exchange with the intense focus of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Suddenly her face changed, understanding dawning in her young eyes. "You don't actually want Grandma here," she said to her parents, her voice small but clear. "You want her money here." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Emily's face went pale, then flushed red again. Doug's jaw tightened in the way it did when business deals weren't going according to his projections. "Madison, that's not—" Emily began. "It is, though," Tyler interrupted, his teenage directness cutting through adult obfuscation. "That's exactly what it is. And it's messed up." I looked at my grandchildren, really looked at them, and saw something I'd been too buried in my own pain to notice before. They weren't comfortable with how I'd been treated either. They'd just been too young, too powerless, too conditioned to accept their parents' version of normal, to recognize it for what it was. "I forgive you," I said to Emily and Doug, my voice calm with the peace that comes from finally speaking truth. "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean continuing to enable behavior that hurts everyone involved, including you." Emily's eyes filled with tears, though whether from anger, shame, or genuine remorse, I couldn't tell. "Mom, Please. We can work this out. We can find a better arrangement, something that works for everyone. We can, I agreed, starting with the understanding that I'm not your financial resource to manage. I'm your mother and grandmother, and I deserve to be treated with the same respect you'd want for yourselves when you're my age. Doug was already reaching for his phone, probably calculating how much this newfound independence was going to cost their carefully planned budget. Linda, be reasonable. Where are you even going to go? What are you going to do? The question was meant to highlight my dependency, to remind me of my limitations and vulnerabilities. Instead, it reminded me of something I'd forgotten in 3 years of diminishing expectations. I was Linda Margaret Thompson. I had survived the death of my parents, the challenges of military wife life, raising a child through difficult teenage years, burying the love of my life and starting over at 71. I had survived much worse than this. I'm going to live, I said simply. And for the first time in years, I'm going to live as myself, not as your version of who you think I should be. That evening, I called Margaret again. I told her, it's time for me to come home. Margaret's guest room smelled like lavender and old wood, familiar scents that wrapped around me like my mother's arms. The morning light streamed through lace curtains that had yellowed with age but remained beautiful, casting delicate patterns across the hardwood floor that creaked with the gentle protests of a house that had sheltered 3 generations of family love. I woke before dawn on my first morning of freedom, not from anxiety or insomnia, but from the deep peace that comes when your soul finally recognizes home. Through the thin walls, I could hear Margaret moving around her kitchen, humming, "How Great Thou Art," while she prepared coffee in the same percolator she'd used for 40 years. For the first time in months, I dressed without considering anyone else's schedule or expectations. I chose my soft yellow cardigan, the one Ray had always said made me look like sunshine, and took time to pin my mother's cameo brooch at the collar. In Margaret's hallway mirror, I saw someone I'd almost forgotten, a woman with dignity and tact, with choices to make, with a day ahead that belonged entirely to her. "Morning, beautiful," Margaret called from the kitchen as I appeared in her doorway. "Coffee's ready, and I made those biscuits you used to love at church potlucks." The kitchen was everything Emily's sterile space was not. Warm wood cabinets painted cream yellow, mismatched dishes that told stories of decades of family meals, a round table scarred with the evidence of homework sessions and holiday preparations, and quiet conversations between women who'd learned to treasure each other's company. We sat together in comfortable silence, these 2 women who'd prayed through raising children, buried husbands, and survived the particular challenges that come with loving families who sometimes forgot to love you back. The biscuits were perfect, flaky and warm, spread with butter that Margaret still bought from the farmer's market every Saturday. "You look different," Margaret observed, studying my face with the attention of someone who'd known me through every season of adult life. "Lighter somehow. Like you've been carrying something heavy and finally set it down." "I have," I admitted, surprised by how true those words felt. "I've been carrying the weight of trying to earn my place in a family that should have just given it to me." After breakfast, Margaret drove me to the bank in her ancient Buick, the one her son kept threatening to replace with something more appropriate for someone her age. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. We were 2 women in our 70s, driving an old car to reclaim financial independence from families who thought they knew better than we did about managing our own lives. The bank manager, a pleasant woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, treated me with the professional courtesy reserved for clients with substantial assets. She didn't question my competence or suggest I needed someone younger to help me understand complicated financial matters. She simply processed my requests with efficient respect. "I'd like to establish a new savings account," I told her, "and transfer most of my funds there. I also want to set up automatic payments for my own expenses: rent, utilities, groceries, medical costs." For the first time in 3 years, I was planning a budget that served my needs rather than subsidizing someone else's lifestyle. The freedom felt intoxicating, like discovering I could fly after years of being told I was too fragile to walk. That afternoon, Margaret and I visited the apartment complex where her friend Dorothy had moved after her husband's death. Sunset Gardens was nothing like the sterile assisted living facility Emily had researched. This was independent senior housing, where capable adults happened to be over 65 but weren't treated like children because of it. The one-bedroom unit available had large windows that faced east, perfect for morning prayers and coffee. The kitchen was small but complete, with room for the few pieces of cookware I'd need to prepare simple meals for one. The living area was cozy without being cramped, large enough for my reading chair and the small television I'd want for evening news and Sunday morning services. The rent includes utilities, explained the property manager, a middle-aged man who spoke to me like an adult capable of making informed decisions. There's a community room downstairs for gatherings, a small library, and a van that takes residents to grocery stores and medical appointments twice a week. I signed the lease that same day, using my maiden name for the first time in 46 years, Linda Margaret Walsh. The signature felt like a small rebellion, a reminder that I'd existed before I became someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's burden. That evening, Margaret and I sat on her front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed too beautiful for anything but divine artistry. The air was warm with late spring promises, and somewhere down the street, children played games that filled the evening with laughter and the comfortable sounds of family life that didn't require anyone to sacrifice their dignity for belonging. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Margaret told me, her voice soft with the particular gentleness that comes at the end of long days filled with meaningful work. "About earning your place in a family that should have just given it to you." I nodded, waiting for the wisdom I knew she was preparing to share. "I think," she continued, "that sometimes God allows us to lose things we thought we needed so we can find things we actually need, like discovering that His love for us isn't conditional on how useful we are to other people." Her words settled over me like a blessing, confirmation of something I'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. For 3 years, I'd been trying to prove my worth through service, sacrifice, and silent endurance, but God's love, the love that truly mattered, had never required proof. Sunday morning arrived with church bells from 3 different congregations calling their flocks to worship. Margaret and I dressed in our best clothes, not because God required finery, but because some occasions deserve our finest efforts. I wore my navy dress with the pearl buttons and my mother's cameo, feeling like royalty because that's exactly what I was. A daughter of the king. The sanctuary looked exactly as I'd left it 3 years ago, though some faces were missing and new ones had appeared. The wooden pews still bore the subtle indentations of decades of faithful bottoms, and the stained glass windows still cast rainbow light across the altar where I'd been married, where Emily had been baptized, where Ray's funeral service had celebrated a life well lived. Pastor Williams had aged in my absence, his hair completely white now, but his voice still strong with the authority of someone who'd spent 40 years helping people find God in their darkest moments. When he spotted me in the congregation, his face lit up with genuine joy. "Friends," he announced during the greeting time, "we have a prodigal daughter returned to us today. Linda Thompson has come home." The warmth that surrounded me was immediate and overwhelming. Handshakes and hugs from people who remembered when I'd organized the church picnics, taught Sunday school to restless children, coordinated meal trains for families in crisis. These people had known me when I was someone who mattered, someone whose contributions were valued, and whose presence was a gift rather than a burden. During the pastoral prayer, Pastor Williams's words seemed directed specifically at my situation. "Lord, we thank you for the seasons of wilderness that teach us to depend entirely on your provision. We thank you for the relationships that challenge us to remember our worth comes from you alone, not from how well we serve the expectations of others." I closed my eyes and felt tears streaming down my cheeks, not tears of sadness, but of homecoming, of recognition, of a soul finally returning to the place where it belonged. After the service, I lingered in the fellowship hall, drinking coffee from the same mismatched cups we'd used for decades, eating cookies made by women who still remembered my grandmother's recipe for snickerdoodles. The conversations flowed around me like a river I'd been away from too long. Discussions of grandchildren and gardens, health challenges and small victories, the ordinary concerns of people who'd learned to find God in daily life, rather than just in Sunday morning services. Dorothy approached me near the end of the social hour, her face serious with the particular concern of someone who'd walked similar paths. "Linda," she said quietly, "I heard through Margaret that you've made some big changes. How are you feeling about everything?" I considered the question carefully, wanting to give an honest answer to someone who'd earned the right to truth through her own courage in choosing independence over comfortable dependency. I said slowly, like I've been holding my breath for 3 years and finally remembered how to breathe. She nodded with the understanding of someone who'd made similar choices. It's scary at first, isn't it? Taking responsibility for your own happiness instead of waiting for other people to provide it. Terrifying, I agreed, but also liberating. For the first time in years, I'm making decisions based on what God wants for me, not on what other people think I should want. That afternoon, I called my new apartment complex and arranged for utilities to be connected. I contacted a local furniture store about delivering a simple bedroom set and a comfortable reading chair. I made an appointment to transfer my medical records to a doctor closer to my new home. Each phone call felt like a small act of resurrection, evidence that I was capable of managing my own life despite Emily's dire predictions about my declining competence. As evening approached, I sat in Margaret's garden reading my Bible, letting the words of Psalm 30 wash over me. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. My phone buzzed with a text message from Madison. "Grandma, are you okay? Mom says you're making a mistake, but I think you're being brave. I love you." I stared at those words for a long time, understanding that sometimes the greatest gift we can give the people we love is showing them what it looks like to choose dignity over safety, truth over peace, God's approval over human acceptance. I texted back, "I love you too, sweetheart." Sometimes being brave looks like a mistake to people who've forgotten how to choose faith over fear. That night, I slept deeply in Margaret's guest room, my dreams filled with images of the life I was building, a small apartment where I could pray without hiding, meals I could prepare according to my own tastes, days that belonged to me and to God instead of to other people's expectations. Tomorrow, I would begin the practical work of moving into my new home. But tonight, I rested in the peace that comes from finally understanding that I was Linda Margaret Walsh Thompson, a woman beloved by God, valued by true friends, and worthy of respect regardless of how useful I was to anyone else. For the first time in years, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. 6 months later, I stood at my kitchen window watching the first snow of winter dust the courtyard of Sunset Gardens like powdered sugar on a cake. My small apartment had become a sanctuary. Walls painted the soft yellow I'd always loved, furnished with pieces I'd chosen for comfort rather than impression, filled with the peaceful silence of a woman who'd finally learned the difference between loneliness and solitude. The morning routine I'd developed felt like worship. Coffee in my favorite mug while reading scripture at my small dining table. Prayers offered in my own voice without fear of judgment or interruption. Breakfast prepared according to my own preferences and dietary needs. At 74, I was learning what it meant to live for an audience of one. My phone rang as I was preparing for the women's Bible study I now led every Tuesday morning. The caller ID showed Madison's name, and my heart lifted with the joy that had become my default response to contact from my granddaughter. "Good morning, sweetheart," I answered, settling into my reading chair with the anticipation of someone who'd learned that unexpected calls didn't always bring crisis. "Hi, Grandma Linda." Madison's voice carried a maturity I hadn't heard 6 months ago, as if witnessing one person's courage had awakened something in her own spirit. "I wanted to call before school. I have something to tell you." At 14 now, Madison had grown into the kind of young woman who thought deeply about important matters, who asked questions that adults sometimes found uncomfortable, who'd inherited both her grandfather's moral clarity and her grandmother's stubborn insistence on truth. "I'm listening," I said, though I suspected I knew what was coming. "I told Mom and Dad I want to spend Christmas with you this year. Not the whole family Christmas. Your Christmas. Just you and me." The words hit me with unexpected force. Not because they were surprising, but because they represented something I'd learned to hope for but never demand. The possibility that choosing dignity over convenience might actually result in deeper relationships rather than permanent exile. "What did they say?" I asked carefully. Madison's laugh carried notes of both frustration and determination. Mom said I was being manipulated by your dramatic behavior. Dad said it wasn't fair to abandon family traditions. But Tyler backed me up. He said maybe some traditions need to change. My grandson had surprised everyone with his steady support over the past months. At 17 now, he'd begun questioning family dynamics he'd previously accepted without examination, asking pointed questions about respect and love that made his parents uncomfortable. "And how do you feel about all this family tension?" I asked, because the last thing I wanted was for my grandchildren to feel caught between loyalty to their parents and affection for me. "I feel like you taught me something important," Madison replied with the kind of clarity that suggested she'd been thinking about this conversation for weeks. "You taught me that love isn't supposed to make you smaller. It's supposed to help you become who God made you to be." After we hung up, I sat in my chair for a long time, holding the phone and marveling at how God could use even painful family situations to plant seeds of wisdom in young hearts. Madison was learning at 14 what it had taken me 74 years to understand, that true love liberates rather than imprisons, builds up rather than tears down. The Tuesday morning Bible study had grown from the original 3 women to a group of 12, all of us navigating the particular challenges of aging with dignity, in a culture that often treated elderly women as problems to be managed rather than people to be valued. We met in the community room downstairs, where large windows provided natural light and comfortable chairs accommodated arthritic joints and decreased mobility. Today's discussion focused on the Book of Ruth, specifically the verse that had become my personal anthem: "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." "I used to think this passage was only about romantic love," said Eleanor, a recent widow whose children lived in different states and visited sporadically. "But I'm beginning to understand it's about choosing your community, choosing where you belong." Dorothy nodded emphatically, her gray hair catching the morning light in a way that made her look distinguished rather than old. "After my Harold died, my daughter kept saying I needed to move closer to her family, but her family wasn't my community. They were nice enough people, but they didn't know me before I became Grandma Dorothy." "That's exactly it," I said, feeling the truth settle into words I'd been trying to articulate for months. Sometimes the people who love us think they know what's best for us, but they're basing those decisions on who they think we are now, not who we've always been. The conversation continued for another hour, winding through topics that ranged from practical matters like managing finances and medical care to deeper questions about purpose and identity in the later stages of life. These women had become my true family, not because we shared blood, but because we shared understanding, respect, and the kind of love that didn't require anyone to diminish themselves for someone else's comfort. After the study ended, I walked to the small grocery store 6 blocks from my apartment, enjoying the independence of choosing my own food according to my own tastes and budget. The autumn air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the neighborhood around Sunset Gardens buzzed with the comfortable activity of a community where people knew each other's names and checked on each other's well-being. At the store, I ran into Pastor Williams, who was selecting apples with the careful attention of someone whose wife had given him specific instructions about which varieties to avoid. "Linda!" He greeted me with the warmth that had made him beloved by 3 generations of congregation members. "How are you settling in? Are you finding everything you need?" "More than I need," I replied honestly. "I'm finding things I didn't even know I was missing." He smiled with the understanding of someone who'd counseled enough people through major life transitions to recognize the signs of authentic transformation. "And how are things with your family? I know that situation has been challenging." I considered the question carefully, wanting to give an answer that reflected both truth and grace. "They're learning that I'm still their mother and grandmother, but I'm also a complete person with my own relationship with God. It's an adjustment for everyone, including you, I imagine. Especially me," I admitted. "It turns out that when you spend years trying to earn love through service, you forget that you're worthy of love just because you exist." Pastor Williams nodded thoughtfully. "One of the hardest lessons we learn in this life is that God's love isn't conditional on our usefulness to other people. Sometimes He allows us to be stripped of our roles so we can rediscover our identity as His beloved children." That evening, I prepared dinner for one in my small kitchen, listening to hymns on the radio while I cooked vegetables from my own garden plot in the courtyard. The meal was simple, but satisfying, exactly what I wanted to eat, prepared the way I preferred, served on dishes I'd chosen because they brought me joy rather than impressed anyone else. As I ate, I reflected on the conversation with Pastor Williams and the phone call from Madison, understanding that both represented different aspects of the same truth. Transformation is possible at any age, but it requires the courage to choose authenticity over acceptance, God's approval over human applause. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. When I opened it, I found a message from a woman named Carol, whose daughter attended the same church as Emily. "Hi, Mrs. Thompson. I heard about your situation through mutual friends. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to talk with me. I think I might be going through something similar with my own family." I stared at the message for a long time, understanding that this was how God often works, using our pain to help others, transforming our struggles into sources of strength for people walking similar paths. I typed back, "I'd be happy to talk with you, Carol. Would you like to meet for coffee this week?" Her response came immediately, "Yes, please. I feel so alone in this." That night, as I prepared for bed in my own space, surrounded by belongings I'd chosen and arranged according to my own preferences, I felt a deep gratitude that had nothing to do with material circumstances and everything to do with spiritual freedom. I opened my Bible to Jeremiah 29:11 and read aloud, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you hope and a future." At 74, I was discovering that God's plans for my future were bigger than I'd imagined possible. Not just personal peace and independence, but the opportunity to help other women find their way out of families that loved them conditionally, to show them that respect and dignity weren't luxuries, but birthright gifts from a God who never required them to earn his love. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about the Christmas Madison wanted to spend with me, about the coffee date with Carol, about the Bible study women who'd become my chosen family, about the small apartment that had become a sanctuary. 6 months ago, I'd been living in exile in my own daughter's house, invisible and voiceless, slowly disappearing into the role of grateful burden. Tonight, I was Linda Margaret Walsh Thompson, a woman beloved by God, valued by true friends, useful to his kingdom in ways I was still discovering. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been nights of doubt, days of loneliness, moments when the safety of invisible servitude seemed preferable to the uncertainty of authentic living. But God had been faithful through every step of the journey, providing exactly what I needed when I needed it. Wisdom from Scripture, support from friends, courage from prayer, and the gradually dawning understanding that my worth had never been conditional on anyone else's approval. I was finally free to be exactly who he'd created me to be. And at 74 years old, that felt like the most beautiful beginning imaginable. Have you ever felt like you had to earn your place in your own family? Have you experienced the pain of being treated like a burden instead of a blessing? How did your faith help you find the courage to choose dignity over convenience? If this story touched your heart, please share it in the comments below. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give each other is the reminder that we're not alone in our struggles. If you found hope in Linda's journey, please like this video and subscribe to our channel so this message can reach someone else who needs to hear that it's never too late to choose authentic living over comfortable hiding. May God bless everyone who's ever had to choose between being loved for who they are and being accepted for what they provide. In Jesus' name, amen.